Good afternoon, everyone. Oh dear, that's way too loud. I'll sit right back. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Razia Iqbal. I work for the BBC in London. We're here to launch a novel, a debut novel by Emma Glass. It's called Peach. But I think we're also here to launch and celebrate what I think is a quite astonishing, new, fresh, and powerful literary voice. The book could be described as a rape revenge novel, but that, I think, sells it really quite short. In terms of language, this is a gut-punching novel. It's just under 100 pages long, and it's the experience of a young girl called Peach, recovering from a brutal sexual assault. It's visceral, it's raw, and one reason it is that is because of the experimental and poetic language that Emma has chosen to write in. So we're going to start with Emma reading the opening, because I'm fairly sure that everyone in the audience has not read this novel, and it does give you an immediate evocation of what the rest of the book is like. It's difficult, so brace yourselves. And also, if you can, have warmth and kindness in your heart. This is Emma's very first book. It's also her very first literary festival. So, Emma Glass.
Seamstress. Thick stick, sticky, sticking, wet, ragged wool, winding round the wounds, stitching the sliced skin together as I walk, scraping my mittened hand against the wall. Rough red bricks, ripping the wool, ripping the skin. Rough red skin, rough red head. I pull the fuzzy mitten from my fingers, wincing as the torn threads grip the grazes on my knuckles. It is dark, the blood is black. Dry, crackly, crackling. The smell of burnt fat clogs my nostrils. I put my fingers to my face and wipe the grease away. It clings to my tongue, crawls in my mouth, sliding over my teeth, my cheeks, dripping down my throat. I am sick. The sick is pink in the moonlight, fleshy, fatty. I lean against the wall and close my eyes. I swallow hard. I taste flesh, meat. I am sick again. My eyes flicker, flashes of pink, back to black. My body buzzes against the bricks. I see black, thick black, fat. My eyelids are fat, swollen black from the slap, smothered in grease from his slippery, slimy sausage fingers.
Thank you, Emma. The rest of the novel, Emma, is very much about Peach trying to get over this really quite brutal assault. And I want to start by asking you where that story came from. What is it that propelled you to, first of all, write a story about sexual assault and then start it in that way?
I think when I started writing this book, I didn't really have a sense of the story. I was studying at university. I was studying creative writing, and my dissertation project was to write the first 4 chapters of a novel, which is daunting for anyone who's been given a writing project ever. You know, that you think having no brief, that it would be easy, that you can just throw the doors wide open, but actually it's the hardest thing. I think you need to have some sort of direction. And if you're anything like me, you know, I've never known what I wanted to do. I like a bit of everything. That's the sort of person I am. So finding the direction was difficult at first. And during my writing degree, I was also studying literature. And whilst I was studying creative writing, the literature that I was reading at the time was sort of very experimental. So I was reading things like James Joyce's Ulysses and Gertrude Stein's Tender Buttons, and they were doing something really interesting with language and something that I found really captivating as a reader. But that sort of language I'd never seen in any sort of modern literature, any contemporary books. So when I sat down to write, I thought, well, what I'm interested in is words, not necessarily stories, but how you can convey feelings on a page just with words and punctuation. And that idea really fascinated me. So sitting down to write this, I was becoming more and more frustrated with my inability to think of a story. It was a couple of days before submission for the project because I'm a bit last minute as well. And in sort of my frustration, I just had to clear my mind, and I closed my eyes and I thought about things that were very present at that moment. And what was present was, it was late at night, it was dark. I was very literal about everything, and I was drawing on the feelings that I had. And rather than trying to think about things that I don't know and think of a story that I didn't know, I was thinking about my own story and what do I know about myself. And at that time, I was angry, frustrated, tired, and I wanted to see what that would look like. So I drew on those raw emotions and just started putting down words. And the words came out, and the bit that I just read, those were the first words that I wrote of the book. And it just started from there. And when I went with it, and when I relaxed, and when I saw the words coming together, and when I read them back and heard the kind of poetry that I was making, which was surprising, I never set out to write any poetry, I was encouraged by that. And then I saw this image of a girl, and I carried on writing, and I still didn't know the story, but I knew this girl was upset, and she was angry, and something had happened to her. And then the story came, and then I realized what had happened to her. And it built from there, really. But it's the most interesting thing when I finished it, and I showed it to a friend of mine. She said, wow, you have such an authentic way of describing this. Is this something you've experienced? And I said, no. What do you mean? And she was like, you've written a story about sexual assault. And I was like, no. I hadn't realized the whole while, and I know that maybe sounds silly, but I hadn't realized that that's what I had written. I was so just taken by the flow of the language and the world of Peach and what I'd created. There's lots of surreal elements in there. There are lots of different characters, and it's some are funny. There's some comedy in there. Yeah,
there certainly is. One of the things that's interesting about the fact that it's very raw and visceral is that there is a lot in the book that is surreal, and I wonder whether that was something that you were aware of slipping into. So you go from something that is quite tangible, a young woman running away having just been assaulted, the smell of the man who has assaulted her, the feel of the man who's just assaulted her is still in her nostrils for days afterwards. She can smell the meat, she can smell fried fat around herself quite a lot, no matter how many showers she takes. But then that slips into some really rather strange observations. She is at college and she describes a teacher who's called Mr. Custard, and there's an awful lot of food imagery in this novel as well. And did you find yourself, as you were writing the kind of stream of consciousness, that you slipped from the real to the surreal with ease?
Yeah, and the oddest thing is, it was also easy, and I'm still trying to think about the process and where the ideas came from, and I think once I realized the magic of analyzing, very small things, so like I was saying about that emotion of frustration, I sort of worked out the trick, really. So I found myself at one point buying a package of sausages. This sounds very odd, by the way. I'm not strange, but I found it really helpful to immerse myself. And so when I was saying about drawing on what I knew at the time, I was vegetarian, and I was trying to create that idea of things that disgust me, because I wanted to put out this contempt for this person who had committed such an awful crime against this girl, but having no experience of what that's like, I was drawing on things that repelled me, and at the time it was meat. So I bought a pack of sausages, and I kept them raw, and I smelt them, and I took them apart, and I looked at the ingredients and what they felt like in their raw state, and then I cooked them. I cooked them to smell that I burnt them so I would know what that pungent smell was, and it was only really by immersing myself in that I felt I was able to write down the emotions that went with it, and then I thought, well, this is the inspiration, so why not just make it that? I had this idea that at university I had a real issue with metaphors, because I think very literally almost always, and I'm very gullible. So if somebody says to me, the sky's green, I'll think about it first before I agree, even though that I know that that's a fact. But I was reading at the time a book by Bret Easton Ellis, and it's Luna Park. And at the start of that book, it's almost semi-autobiographical, and at the start of the book he says, everything in this book is exactly true. Everything that happens exactly happened. And I sort of thought, oh, okay, fine, I'll go along with that. And then halfway through the book, his house starts to melt. And you realize that he doesn't mean literally, but maybe he does. I got into this massive debate in my seminar saying, but it is true, it could be true, maybe it's true for him. So I thought the same in my book, and I think if you read Peach, there are two readings of it. There's the reading that there's a girl and the world around her could be imaginary, but for me it's very literal, because why not?
It's really interesting. I suppose at this stage it might be helpful to tell the audience that you work as a nurse in a hospital in London, a children's hospital in London, and you're continuing to do that while you're writing and going to your creative writing classes. I'm not sure, we haven't really talked about the substance of the conversation that we were going to have today, but I was thinking about it last night, and I do feel that I'd quite like to tell the audience that quite soon after the extract that Emma read for you, the assault, the rape is so brutal that, and she tells nobody, that she attempts herself to stitch her own vagina with a needle and a thread. And even that is described with astonishing clarity and rawness. And I'm only mentioning it because you are a nurse, and I think even an experienced medical professional would have real difficulty reading that without flinching, without feeling really quite a profound sense of pause that a young girl would choose to do that, having walked past her parents, her sexually liberal parents, up the stairs, them not noticing that she's been assaulted, and then she does this to her own body. When you say that this came with ease, did those sorts of images just come into your head?
It's a difficult one to answer without sounding like a lunatic, but again...
You definitely don't sound like a lunatic, so just go with it.
But again, I feel like writing this book was such an out-of-body experience for me, and lots of people assume that because I'm a nurse, that's where I drew the inspiration for the very kind of physical scenes, but actually those are some of the first scenes that I wrote when I was 21 and studying literature. And I said in a talk yesterday, I obviously must just have some inherent kind of macabre feelings, internally. But actually, I think what enabled me to write those was the thought in my mind always that the world is surreal. And actually, I think at that point, I was really entirely convinced that she was a piece of fruit. She was less girl, more fruit, and there was a distance for me. And I think maybe that's why the book has some sort of appeal now, because it brings that kind of violence and those kind of, very deep emotions, it brings it to a wider audience because there's distance, because there is always the potential that she's a piece of fruit or that it's a dream. There's so many different takes on it. But I think the images came, and I've always had quite a broad mind, and I've always been interested in, I guess as a teenager growing up, I watched a lot of horror films, and there's an element that I recognize now, 10 years on, that I was, morbidly fascinated, but now actually reading this with many years of seeing people in poor condition, needing medical attention, I wince. I can't watch gory horror films anymore. Things on the news. There's a popular program in the UK, 24 Hours in A&E. I can't watch it. I work in a hospital every day. I see it every day, but I can't watch it. But I found it easy to write because the language flowed and the images for me were very blurred. And yeah, it's
There are moments when, as you've been talking, that it's occurred to me that when you talk about all of these things and images and thoughts just being in your head, you say that there might be something macabre in your own psyche, but it does strike me that perhaps well, it's a question. Do you think that most people have all kinds of really quite dark, surreal, funny things that are going on in their head, and what you have done is attempt to realize them in this particular story?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that. I think as human beings, we are attracted to the physicality of our beings, and I think people do. I don't think I'm alone in my morbidity. I think it's an area of fascination because it's so alien. Like you said, not many people would be able to repair their own wounds. But I think the idea of that and that kind of it's almost like a survival instinct. I think everybody has that. I just made it a lot more physical. But I'm really interested in that as well. I'm the sort of person I feel emotions very extremely, and this book for me was very, very self-indulgent. I mean, to find myself here talking about it is so crazy and surreal because I never thought that anybody else would read it, and now that people read it, I feel like I have to have answers for why. But actually, what I was doing was I was trying to make the feelings tangible, almost so that I could understand what they were. And that's kind of where I want to go as a writer. I want people to have a shared experience, and I want to do that very simply. And I think by deconstructing language, you're able to do that.
The smell of meat and fat and frying stayed with me after I read the book. And in a way, it's a book that you can't read in the way that many people would read books, which is to read a few pages, put it down, pick it up again. It felt to me, and it is how I read it, as a book that demands your attention from the moment you open it, and I read it in one sitting. And then I read it again on the plane coming over here. And I did read different things into it the second time, which is why I think it's astonishing that you talk about it as having written it, very quickly in one kind of full stream of consciousness. When you think about, this is your debut book, and you think about yourself as a writer now, do you think about yourself as a writer now?
No, not at all. It's so strange. But because I'm still so immersed in my day-to-day life, I still work full-time at the hospital, and I try to keep the two worlds quite separate, because when people ask me about the book and they ask what's it about, is it a romance, and I kind of go, oh no, how do I describe this without again people
well, the main
thinking
character's a peach. Oh no, she's called Peach, she could be a peach.
It's very difficult. Also, there's still a part of me that's very self-conscious, because this, as I said, was very self-indulgent, and although it's not my story, it's not my although it came very easily, when I realized the monster I had created, the recovery from that was huge. And
What do you mean by that?
about the monster or
No,
the
the recovery.
Well, I think it's I think because of the type of book it is, and I've said already, I've had to draw on what I know and those emotions, and I often found myself bringing things to the surface that I'd perhaps repressed. I think everyone to some extent has experienced tragedy, personal trauma in many different ways, and I don't think you can escape or live a full life without those experiences. So those experiences, the experiences that I've had, growing up and in my adult life, and particularly in the work that I do, I see a lot of tragedy around me, and it's hard to not let that impact you, but I was certainly drawing on things that I'd perhaps forgotten about or I'd left buried, and bringing those up to the surface and analyzing them and pulling them out into words on the page. That was pretty exhausting. And then in the first round, when people started to read the book and they've realized there's all these themes in it which kind of escape my attention to a degree, then having to think and process that and take on the responsibility for that. Because I think it's really hard to write a book nowadays, and it's going to mean a lot of different things to different people, but in the kind of society and certainly the news in America and in the UK at the moment, all the sexual harassment cases that have recently emerged, this is, maybe it's fortunate, maybe it's unfortunate for me, but the time of the book has meant that it's gotten quite a lot of attention in regards to those, particularly the movements on Facebook and Twitter, the Me Too movement and Time's Up, and those sorts of things. People have read a lot into it, and everyone wants to know my opinion now on those topics. And I didn't necessarily set out to explore those topics. So it's a responsibility, and also having people who connect with the book because it is their story, and dealing with people's emotions. I'm so pleased that it has touched people, and I'm so pleased that people get different things out of it. But there is a weight of responsibility. So the recovery is where I was trying to get to.
Okay, well, you'll be relieved to hear that I'm not going to ask for your opinion on #MeToo. Or,
Thank you.
I certainly didn't read those things into it. But what does intrigue me is that you started out by talking about yourself as somebody who didn't have the story to begin with, right? You were thinking about images, it was dark, you were thinking about a young woman, she was in danger or was upset in some way. You have, of course, constructed a story with several characters around the character of Peach. Given that there is such a stream of consciousness element in the book, how did those characters emerge? Did you have the character of Peach in your mind fairly clearly as you started to write, and then the others came more naturally because of that?
Yeah, I think the character of Peach was the one thing that emerged crystal clearly and stayed with me. And I went back and forth with this book for over 8 years. It took 8 years to write 98 pages, but once she was there, I knew what was going to happen in terms of the ending. I knew her fate. I knew that immediately. And then finding how to get there. What I was really conscious of was the darkness in the book, and I wanted to make some lightness there, because yes, she's isolated and she doesn't tell anyone, but the characters around her are very tender towards her, and there's a lot of love there. She just doesn't tap into it because, for whatever reason. The other characters are very fondly based on quite a lot of friends and family, and I don't know any piles of sand that are able to talk, but there are elements of there are characteristics of people that I know, and certainly my parents are not that liberal either, but sometimes Green is based on a friend of mine, and he's incredibly tall, like
Green
a tree.
is Peach's boyfriend.
He's like a tree, and he's certainly very much a stable element in my life, and so that's where I drew that from. But once I realized the type of girl that Peach was, and I think once I had the sensibility of her, I'm a very tactile person, like I said about the weird thing with the sausages, but the feel and textures of things speak to me. So when I knew what I wanted to do with her, I felt that everybody else in the world had to be similarly very visceral and strange and related to something. My favorite character, I know you didn't ask, but my favorite character in the book is Trunk, and Trunk for me is an enormous pair of swimming trunks, and she just kind of flaps about the place. But I wanted to bring some lightness to the darkness, and I think through the love of people that I have in my life, that's where I kind of extract that and put it into the book for Peach.
Well, you certainly managed it. Thank you very much. Yeah, I was just going to turn to that. Thank you very much indeed, Emma. So if anyone's got any questions, if you don't, I can carry on asking, but do please feel free to raise your hand and wait for a microphone. Oh, there's a hand up at the back. Fantastic.
Hello, Emma. Lovely to hear you speak again. So one of the things that a lot of people critique about writing about sexual violence is that if one has not experienced it, you can't often bring the nuance to the writing. And for a lot of survivors, it often becomes difficult to read writing by writers who have not experienced sexual violence. Did you grapple with that question at all? Well, I was done asking my question, but I've been asked to get up. But really, do you think as a writer you've struggled with the idea that you're communicating an experience, you're writing an experience, and putting it out into the world where people have actually experienced it? So, when you talk about the incapacity for an individual to tap into the love around them, somebody perhaps who's experienced sexual violence and trauma associated with it, they might explain to you exactly what was going on with them and, why they maybe have been incapable of accepting that love. So do you feel that perhaps as a writer, there is perhaps a little bit of injustice done to the subjects that you cover if you haven't experienced them yourself?
I'm not sure I got the whole stretch of your question, but I think what I get from that is, do I feel that there's justice done for victims through this book? I think everyone's experience is completely different, and it goes back to what I was saying about the responsibility that I now take. And certainly some people have asked me, how can you write something that you've not experienced? But again, it's drawing on my own personal trauma and tragedy. And I think as human beings, there are shared experiences. No, it'll never be how exactly everybody has experienced the situation, but I think feelings of fear, isolation are common amongst all of us. I don't want to make any presumptions, but I think giving voice to this sort of experience is still quite rare, and having it very publicly analyzed. And I think the reason it works as fiction is that people can read and take from it what they want to. And that's what I want for the book. And I want it to be an enabler for people. Perhaps it won't be, but it certainly gets the conversation going about victims of sexual assault, and it brings it to the limelight. And hopefully people will take from the book, yes, perhaps a very horrible experience, but perhaps also they'll gain something from the language and the sensitivity. There is sensitivity there, I think, and it was never intended in any way to be gratuitous. It's very purposeful in the way that I've written it to be sensitive, but also to expose for those people who don't get to expose themselves, who don't get to speak up. Is exposure for them, I guess. I hope that answers your question.
Lady in the front. Could you wait for a microphone? Just up here in the front, please. Thank you.
Emma, you said you were a nurse, and have you ever in your professional career, did you ever come against a girl who was sexually assaulted or even depressed, or somebody, because such cases do come in the hospitals very frequently. And as the book progresses, this rape victim is trying to, as you said, is trying to come out and how to deal with it. So by the end of the book, or how it progresses, did you feel while writing it, you were also going into that mode? Like you said, you bought a sausage and you were what you experienced. So till the end of the book, were you also going through the same experiences?
Sorry, what's the
Or
last one?
maybe the same set of traumas like she went through?
Did I feel those?
Yeah.
No. I think no is the answer. I think the experience that I had writing this book will never match anybody's experiences of violence, but I did feel a connection to the story, and I felt a connection. I think what I really connected with most was the isolation element. In answer to the first part of the question, I work with children, and I haven't drawn any experiences from my patients. I think there must be a lot of sensitivity and respect around that, but I'm aware of the commonality of assault, and my hospital is not a trauma center, so we see different elements, but certainly I've heard stories, and I'm very much inspired by the physical elements of the body and conditions, so I take a lot of inspiration from body systems, as odd as that sounds. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
I think we've probably got time for one very, very short one. Just the last hand that's just gone up. Thank you.
Hi, Emma. So I heard you speak yesterday as well, and it's good to hear from you again. So I wanted to ask, how much would you say that the amount of empathy a person can feel, or rather, if you had empathy to any trauma or tragedy that you may have heard of or known of, played a part? Because so far you've only talked about the images that influenced you, right? So I wanted to know if you actually felt somebody else's trauma, like, you felt what they were going through, that you were that empathetic so that you could add that rawness in your writing.
Again, I think the trauma's all my own, so it's drawn from experiences, maybe not physical ones, but it's like I threw up on the page, basically. And yeah, the trauma's all my own. I think now when readers read it and connect with it because of the shared experience that they have with the character in the book, now, yes, of course, I see where maybe our experiences are similar on that kind of deep emotional level. I started writing this when I was very young, and the world has changed a lot since the book came out. So again, it's dealing with how it's read now versus how it would have been read 10 years ago. But yeah, I still stand by those emotions that I've felt, and it's a very difficult thing to talk about because I feel entirely exposed because I brought the feelings from deep inside. I didn't do a lot of research into this book, but the whole publication of it has been enlightening, and certainly I know that there are more people and there are more experiences that I can look into and hopefully take forward to represent other people in my future work.
I think from everything that Emma has said, not just in the interview but in the answers to your questions, suggests that there is a profound power in the imagination, and in a way that can only be experienced by you if you choose to buy and read the book. For now, though, I would just like to thank Emma for being absolutely amazing in your first interview.
Thank you.
Well done. Thank you very much, and thanks very much for coming.